The morning Victor Hale fired the best nurse Delwood General had ever employed, he did it with a smirk and a styrofoam cup of coffee in his hand. He didn't even stand up from his chair. She walked out of that hospital carrying a single cardboard box, 31 stitched field wounds worth of experience folded quietly behind her eyes, and not one word of protest on her lips. The hallways watched her go. Monitors beeped. A janitor stopped mopping. And somewhere above them both, in a corridor she would never see, a decision was already being made inside a government building 400 miles away. A decision that would bring 2 black federal SUVs rolling through Delwood's early morning fog 48 hours later, headlights cutting through the dark like something official and inevitable. Victor Hale would still be holding his coffee when the world he thought he controlled began to come apart at the seams. If this story already has your attention, follow me now. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Let's go. The fluorescent lights in the ICU had been flickering for 3 days and nobody had fixed them. That detail said more about Delwood General Hospital than any inspection report ever could. The building sat at the southern edge of Carver City, a mid-sized industrial town that had never quite finished deciding whether it was growing or shrinking. The hospital was the same way. 8 floors of aging infrastructure held together by a combination of state funding, administrative optimism, and the quiet competence of a nursing staff that worked too hard and got thanked too rarely. Maya Reeves had been on shift since 6 in the morning. It was now approaching 7:30 at night, and she hadn't eaten since a granola bar at noon. She was 41 years old, medium height, with close-cropped natural hair and the kind of face that gave nothing away when it didn't want to. She had been a nurse for 11 years. 6 of those years had been spent at Delwood General, and in that time, she had become the kind of person the ICU quietly depended on without ever formally acknowledging it. She wasn't a charge nurse. She had been passed over for the promotion twice, both times in favor of candidates who were, as the assistant director of nursing had once explained to her with a straight face, more aligned with the hospital's communication culture. Maya had written that phrase in the margin of a notepad and looked at it for a long time. She was still looking at what it meant. What it meant, in practice, was that Maya noticed things other people didn't, reported what she found, and was consistently penalized for the gap between what she said and what the administration wanted to hear. She had flagged Dr. Preston Marsh's medication dosing patterns 4 months ago. She had documented the discrepancies in writing, submitted them to the ICU supervisor, and followed up twice. Nothing had happened. Marsh was on the medical board's preferred list. He golfed with the right people. The paperwork Maya had submitted was sitting in a filing system somewhere, quietly not being read. 3 weeks later, a patient in Marsh's care had experienced a preventable arrhythmia. The patient had survived, but barely. Maya had been the one at the bedside when it happened. She had been the one who caught it. She had also been the one, when asked in the incident review, who described exactly what she had seen, including the timeline, including the dosing log, including the fact that she had raised concerns about this physician months prior. That had been the beginning of the end. Not immediately. These things never happened immediately. But something shifted in the way Victor Hale looked at her after that meeting. Something shifted in the way her schedule was constructed, the way she was assigned to the more difficult patients without the corresponding support, the way small administrative complaints began appearing in her file. A patient's family had felt she was curt. A physician had noted she was resistant to collaborative direction. None of it was enough to fire her on its own, but it was enough to build a file, and Victor Hale was a man who believed in building files before he acted. Maya worked through it. She kept her head down in the way that didn't mean she was scared. She had learned the difference a long time ago between strategic patience and actual fear, and she knew which one she was practicing. She watched, she documented, she continued doing her job at a level that made her peers rely on her, even as the administration was quietly constructing a justification to remove her. On the Tuesday that everything changed, she was 40 minutes into a shift handover when the call came from bed 7. She moved before she finished thinking. That was something people who hadn't watched her work didn't understand about Maya. There was no visible gear shift, no dramatic pause, no preparation. One moment she was standing at the nurse's station scanning a chart, and the next she was moving down the corridor at a pace that wasn't quite running but covered ground like it. The patient in bed 7 was a 53-year-old man named Garrett Okafor. admitted 2 days earlier for a cardiac observation following a moderate heart attack. He was on the standard monitoring protocol. His vitals had been satisfactory at the last check, and the on-call physician had reviewed his chart that morning and signed off without concern. Maya looked at Garrett Okafor for about 4 seconds before she hit the call button. She had seen something in his color. Not dramatic, not the kind of sudden pallor that set off alarms in every person in the room. Something subtler. The particular quality of gray at the edge of his lips. The slightly too shallow rise of his chest. The way his hands were resting at a specific angle that she couldn't have articulated as a criterion but recognized the same way someone recognizes a familiar face in a crowd. She had seen it before. She had seen it in conditions that had nothing to do with nursing. "Mr. Okafor, can you hear me? I need you to squeeze my hand." He squeezed, weakly. "Good. That's good. Stay with me." The attending who arrived 8 minutes later was Dr. Felicia Wren, a third-year resident who was good at her job and exhausted in the particular way that third-year residents are exhausted, which is to say comprehensively and structurally. She reviewed the monitors, reviewed the chart, and looked at Maya with the careful expression of someone who wanted to take the concern seriously without committing to panic. "His oxygen sats look okay. They're borderline. And look at the waveform." Maya pointed to the monitor. "The pattern's changed in the last 40 minutes. That's not the same rhythm he had at 6. Dr. Wren looked. She was quiet for a moment. "It's within range. It's at the bottom of range, and it's moving in one direction." Maya kept her voice flat, not confrontational, just precise. "I want to request an immediate echo, and I want to get cardiology in here." Wren hesitated in this way residents hesitated when a nurse was telling them something that contradicted the attending's morning sign-off, which was a hesitation that was simultaneously understandable and potentially fatal. "I'll page cardiology," she said finally. "Thank you." Maya stayed at the bedside. She adjusted the oxygen. She talked to Garrett in a low, even voice, not to comfort him with false reassurance, but to keep him present, keep him responding, keep the thread of his consciousness from fraying while they waited. Cardiology arrived 22 minutes later. The cardiologist on call was Dr. Simon Varga, 50-something, gray at the temples, with a reputation for being difficult in direct proportion to the situation's seriousness. He reviewed the monitor data, reviewed the chart, reviewed the echo results, and then was quiet for a moment that Maya read correctly. "You caught early tamponade," he said, not quite to Maya and not quite to anyone else. "That was my concern. Who ordered this echo?" "I requested it through Dr. Wren." Varga looked at her for a moment. Not the look she usually got from physicians, not dismissal or performance of authority. Something more like assessment. "Good call," he said. He was already moving. The procedure that followed took 45 minutes. Garrett Okafor's pericardium had been filling with fluid, slowly, quietly, invisibly to everything except the particular instincts of the nurse who had been watching him. Without intervention, the pressure on his heart would have continued to build until it could no longer pump effectively. The outcome of that scenario was not complicated to predict. When it was over, when Garrett was stabilized and Dr. Varga had gone, and the ICU had returned to its particular hum of controlled urgency, Maya stood in the supply room for a moment with her back against the shelving and breathed. She was tired in a way that was not about the hours. She was tired in a way that was about the constant expenditure of vigilance, the constant translation of what she saw into language that the people above her would accept, the constant performance of deference toward a medical hierarchy that she respected in principle and found maddening in practice. She washed her hands. She went back to work. The conversation with Victor Hale happened the next morning. She was called to his office at 8:15 before her shift technically began. Hale's office was on the 4th floor, an administrative corridor that smelled like carpet cleaner and printer ink, with framed hospital mission statements on the walls. Victor Hale was 58, lean, with the particular look of a man who had spent 3 decades deciding he was the smartest person in rooms that contained people smarter than him. He had a management degree from a state school and a talent for institutional politics that he mistook for leadership. He did not stand up when Maya entered. There was another person in the room, Karen Osei, the director of human resources, sitting to one side of the desk with a folder in her lap and the expression of a person who had made peace with doing something uncomfortable. "Sit down, Maya." She sat. Hale opened his own folder. He took his time. Maya recognized this as a technique, the pause, the unhurried review of documents, the deliberate communication that the outcome of this meeting had been decided before she walked in the door. "I'm going to get straight to it," he said, which was what people said when they intended to do the opposite. "We've been evaluating your performance over the last several months, and we've had some ongoing concerns." "What concerns?" "There's a pattern." He turned a page. "Repeated instances of going outside standard reporting protocols. Difficulty working within established physician-nurse relationships. A communication style that's been described as abrasive by multiple team members." Maya looked at him steadily. "Can you tell me which team members?" "That information is part of an internal review process." "I see." She kept her hand still in her lap. "I'd also note that I caught early cardiac tamponade in a patient yesterday that the morning review had missed. The patient is alive because of it." Hale acknowledged this with the smallest possible movement of his head. "We're aware of the incident. I flagged Dr. Marsh's dosing patterns 4 months ago. In writing, I followed up twice. I'd like to understand how that documentation was handled." "That's a separate matter." "It's not separate. It's the same pattern of patient safety concerns that I've been raising for the better part of a year, and the institutional response has consistently been to characterize me as difficult rather than to address the underlying—" "Maya," his voice cut across hers. Not loud, just flat and final, like a door closing. "I'm informing you that your employment at Delwood General is being terminated, effective today, due to ongoing performance and conduct concerns. Karen has your paperwork." The silence in the room lasted about 4 seconds. Karen Osei looked at her folder. Maya looked at Victor Hale. She looked at him the way she had learned to look at people who had made a significant error before they understood what they had done. Not with anger, which was expensive and usually wasted, but with a kind of clear, quiet measurement. "You'll have an opportunity to review the documentation," Hale continued. "HR will walk you through—" "I understand." She stood. "I'll collect my things." He blinked once at her lack of theater. He had prepared for more. "Is that all?" Maya asked. "That's all." She picked up her bag from the chair beside her. At the door she paused, not for effect, but because what she said next she needed to say correctly. "You made a choice to remove me rather than to address the safety problems I documented," she said. "I want you to understand that I know the difference between those two things, and I want you to know that you should think carefully about what comes next." Hale set his coffee cup down. "Is that a threat?" "No." She held his gaze for one more moment. "It's a fact." She walked out. The corridor was quiet. The elevator was quiet. The lobby was quiet, in the way institutional spaces are quiet at mid-morning, purposeful and unhurried. Maya carried her cardboard box. She had collected it from her locker and packed it with the methodical efficiency she applied to everything, and she walked out the front entrance of Delwood General into a gray November morning. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment. Carver City moved around her. Cars, a delivery truck, someone walking a dog past the hospital entrance without looking up. She was not okay. She knew that. There was a shaking somewhere in the muscles of her arms that she was managing through deliberate stillness, and a pressure behind her sternum that she recognized as something that would need to be addressed later when she was somewhere private. She had been angry before. She had been worse than angry before. She had learned that the feeling and the reaction to the feeling were two different things, and that the gap between them was the only space where she had any real control. She went home. Her apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building on Kellner Street, 14 minutes from the hospital. She had lived there for 4 years. It was clean and spare, not minimalist by design but by practice. She didn't accumulate things because she had spent enough years in circumstances where accumulation wasn't an option. The only objects on her walls were a framed topographical map of the Koringal Valley and a photograph of 8 people in desert camouflage on the tailgate of a vehicle, squinting against flat white light. She sat at her kitchen table and opened her laptop. She began to write. She wrote for 2 hours. Not to anyone specific, not yet. She was organizing incidents, dates, documentation, the chain of events that she understood in its full shape, even if no one in the hospital's administrative structure had ever looked at it that way. She had a particular kind of mind that did this automatically under pressure, had developed it over years in environments where the inability to organize information under stress had consequences that were not administrative. She made coffee. She drank half of it. She kept writing. At 4 in the afternoon, her phone rang from a number she didn't recognize. Washington, D.C. area code. She picked up on the second ring. Maya Reeves. The voice on the other end was male, measured, the particular cadence of someone who spent their working life choosing words carefully. My name is Daniel Forsyth. I'm a senior coordinator with the Office of the Surgeon General. We have a situation that I'd prefer to discuss in person, but I wanted to make first contact by phone. Maya was quiet for a moment. How did you get this number? We've been aware of your work at Delwood General for some time. A pause. We've been monitoring a particular federal concern that intersects with the patient care issues you've been documenting. I understand you were separated from the hospital today. That's correct? I'm sorry to hear it. I'm also going to suggest it may not be permanent, but I need to speak with you directly. Is tomorrow morning workable? Maya looked at the window. The November light was going flat and gray, the way it did at the end of short days. What time? She said. She slept 5 hours, which was more than she expected. She was up before the light, coffee made by 5:30, standing at the kitchen window watching the street below come into its morning form. She put on the clothes she had laid out the night before. Dark slacks, a collared shirt, the small silver stud earrings she wore for situations that required a particular register of presence. Forsyth arrived at 7. He was accompanied by a woman Maya's age, introduced as Special Agent Rosa Kellard, who produced federal credentials in the efficient, unremarkable way of someone who had done it 1,000 times. They sat at Maya's kitchen table. She had made enough coffee. The situation Forsyth described took 20 minutes to lay out, and had been developing, as he explained it, for several months. A pattern of patient outcome discrepancies at Delwood General had been flagged in a federal mortality review the previous spring. Not dramatic discrepancies, not the kind that showed up in news reports. The subtle kind. The kind that only became visible when you knew exactly how to look for them. A federal investigation had been opened quietly. A parallel issue involving Delwood's pharmaceutical supply chain had elevated the concern from a hospital compliance matter to a federal priority. And then there was the other thing. We have a federal protectee, Forsyth said. He kept his voice even. An individual whose medical situation requires a specific level of care and expertise that has become complicated by factors I'm not at liberty to fully detail. We need someone present at Delwood General during an upcoming visit. Someone who can operate within the existing hospital structure, but who has both the medical expertise and the operational background to manage what may be an unpredictable situation. Maya looked at him. You didn't get this number from monitoring my nursing record. Forsyth met her eyes. No. Then you already know what you're asking. We know what we're asking, he confirmed. She was quiet for a moment. Agent Kellard hadn't spoken. She was watching Maya with the patient, contained attention of someone who was also assessing. Walk me through the timeline, Miss, Maya said. She picked up her coffee. Forsyth did. She listened to all of it. She didn't interrupt. She asked 3 questions at the end, each precise and specific, and Forsyth answered them without hesitation. Then she stood up and put her cup in the sink. I'll need my credentials reinstated. That will be arranged by morning. And the patient safety documentation I submitted, the Marsh reports, the incident logs. That documentation needs to be formally received by the federal investigation, not sitting in a hospital folder. Already in process. Maya looked at him for a moment. Okay, she said. What time do you need me there? Outside the window, a car moved slowly up Kellner Street. The morning was just beginning to come together, light pressing through the cloud cover in long, flat lines. Inside the hospital 4 miles away, a patient was being triaged for a medication error that the night staff couldn't fully explain. At the nurses' station, someone looked up from the monitors and said half to themselves, Maya would have caught this 6 hours ago. Nobody disagreed. And in the executive suite, on the 4th floor, Victor Hale was at his desk with his coffee, the morning report open in front of him, satisfied with how the previous day had gone. His phone rang at 7:43. He answered it with the comfortable authority of a man who expected all calls to go as planned. The voice on the other end said 4 words before Hale's hand went still on the desk. He set the coffee down. For the first time in a long time, Victor Hale was not thinking about anything except those 4 words and what they meant and the very specific way in which he had become a man who had made a terrible mistake. The 4 words Victor Hale had heard on the phone were, "This is Agent Forsyth." That was all it had taken. Not a threat, not an explanation, not a single detail about what was coming, just a name attached to a federal credential, delivered in a voice that contained no urgency precisely because it didn't need to. Hale had spent 30 years in hospital administration. He had navigated board disputes and malpractice suits and a state audit that had come within 3 weeks of unraveling everything. He knew when a conversation was the beginning of something much larger than the conversation itself. He sat at his desk for 6 minutes after hanging up without moving. Then he called his lawyer. Maya arrived at Delwood General at 8:52 the following morning. She was not in scrubs. She was in the dark slacks and collared shirt from the day before, and she carried nothing except her badge, reissued that morning by an HR coordinator named Yemi, who had processed the paperwork with her eyes directed at her screen and her mouth in a careful, neutral line. The badge read, Maya Reeves, RN, ICU, which was the same as the one that had been collected from her 40 hours earlier. The building looked the same. The lobby smelled the same. The woman at the information desk glanced up, clocked her, and looked back down without expression. Agent Kellard was already inside. She had arrived first, as planned, and had spent the previous 40 minutes in a conversation with the hospital's head of security that the head of security would later describe to his wife as the most uncomfortable meeting of his professional life. Kellard was not aggressive. She was not raised-voice confrontational. She had simply laid out, in clear and sequential language, the parameters of the federal presence in this building over the coming 48 hours, and the head of security, a retired county sheriff's deputy named Marcus Brandt, who prided himself on reading situations accurately, had understood within the first 3 minutes that he was dealing with something several levels above his jurisdiction. He had nodded a lot. He had asked very few questions. When Kellard finished, he had said, "Whatever you need," in the tone of a man who genuinely meant it. Maya found Kellard near the elevator bank on the 2nd floor. They didn't do anything theatrical. Kellard fell into step beside her, and they moved toward the ICU. "Brandt's cooperative," Kellard said. "Good. Hale's lawyer called this morning, requested information on the nature of the federal review." "What did Forsyth tell him?" "That the review was ongoing, and that Mr. Hale's cooperation would be noted." Kellard's voice was flat. His lawyer didn't push. Maya processed this without comment. The elevator opened on the 3rd floor and they stepped out into the ICU corridor, and there was a moment, a brief, specific moment, where the environment folded around her in the familiar way of a place she knew in her body rather than just in her memory. The smell of the sanitizing solution, the particular acoustic quality of the unit, the layered sound of monitors and ventilators and quiet voices, the fluorescent light that was still flickering at the far end, still unrepaired. She breathed through it and kept walking. The charge nurse on day shift was a woman named Dina Trofimov, 45, broad-shouldered, with 20 years in critical care and the institutional memory of someone who had outlasted 4 different hospital administrations. She was standing at the central station when Maya came in, and the expression that crossed her face was not surprise exactly. It was the look of someone whose private prediction had just been confirmed. Maya. Dina. A pause. Dina looked at Kellard, then back at Maya. "You want to tell me what's happening?" "Not yet. I need a full patient census, and I need the last 6 hours of vitals on anyone in beds 4 through 9. Dina didn't ask again. She pulled up the screen. What Maya was looking for, and found, within 12 minutes, in the chart of a 61-year-old woman named Patricia Sowell in bed 6, was not immediately obvious. Patricia had been admitted the previous evening for respiratory distress following a scheduled chemotherapy infusion. She had been stabilized, placed on supplemental oxygen, and her overnight vitals had been logged as within acceptable parameters by the night staff. But the parameters that had been accepted were wrong. Not dramatically wrong. Wrong in the specific way that institutional complacency produced, a baseline established from an earlier stage of Patricia's treatment that had not been updated to account for the current phase of her chemotherapy protocol. Maya found this in 40 seconds of reading. She found the discrepancy between what the chart said and what the monitor in front of her was showing in another 30. She went to the bedside. Patricia Sowell was awake, or mostly awake, the particular state of thin, medicated consciousness that wasn't sleep but wasn't fully present either. She was a small woman with close-cropped silver hair and hands that were swollen at the knuckles from what looked like long-standing arthritis. She opened her eyes when Maya came in. "Good morning," Maya said, quietly. Not a performance. "You're new." Patricia's voice was hoarse. "I was here before. I just took a few days off." Maya wrapped the cuff around Patricia's arm and watched the reading. Then she listened to her chest. "How's your breathing feel?" "Like I'm trying to breathe through a wet towel." "That's what I thought. I'm going to make some adjustments." Maya straightened. "I'm also going to have a physician come take a look at you. Dr. Varga, if he's in today." "Is something wrong?" "Nothing I can't address. Just some parameters that need updating." She made eye contact with Patricia. "You're not in immediate danger, but you should have been breathing easier than this by now." Patricia looked at her for a moment. "You're the first person who said that out loud." Maya updated the chart. She placed the call to cardiology. She went back to the station and found Dina watching her with a measured expression. "Bed 6 has been flagged since yesterday," Dina said. "I mentioned it in the morning handover." "What happened?" Dr. Marsh said her presentation was consistent with expected post-chemo response and to continue monitoring. Maya kept her voice even. "Okay." "He didn't want to hear it." Dina said it without editorializing. Just the fact, delivered flatly. "He doesn't usually." This was the third documented incident involving Preston Marsh's management decisions in the ICU that Maya had personally witnessed or documented. She was aware, holding this thought, that she was no longer just a nurse making a clinical judgment. She was now, functionally, part of an active federal review of this hospital's patient care standards, and every observation she made carried a different weight than it had 3 days ago. She also understood, with the clarity of someone who had operated in high-stakes environments before, that she needed to be more careful, not less, about how she moved through this space. Not because she was wrong, because the moment she allowed this to become personal, the moment her legitimate anger at what had been done to her bled into her clinical decisions, she became something easier to dismiss. She had made this mistake once, a long time ago, in a different kind of pressure. She wasn't going to make it again. Simon Varga arrived at 10:20. He reviewed Patricia Sowell's chart, reviewed the overnight logs, reviewed the parameters Maya had flagged, and was quiet for a moment that Maya had come to recognize as his specific version of controlled frustration. "The baseline should have been updated on admission," he said. "Yes." "Who was the admitting physician?" Maya said nothing. She didn't need to. Varga looked at her. Something in his expression shifted. A small recalibration, a recognition of the larger context that had arrived in this unit alongside Maya Reeves. He was not a man who was easily maneuvered, but he was not one who ignored what was in front of him. "I'll write the updated orders," he said. "Thank you." He paused at the door. "You shouldn't have been let go." "I know." He left. The morning moved in the way ICU mornings moved, with the deceptive rhythm of sustained emergency, the sense that everything was controlled until suddenly something wasn't. Maya worked through it. She triaged, she monitored, she coordinated with Dina and the other floor nurses, and she did it with the particular quality of focus that some people read as coldness, and that was actually the precise opposite. It was what happened when you cared enough to not let the feeling interfere with the function. At 11:40, Victor Hale appeared in the ICU. He had not come down to the unit in Maya's 6 years at the hospital more than a handful of times, and each occasion had been for some kind of administrative ceremony, a new equipment installation, a donor tour, a photograph for the annual report. He had no clinical background and no particular interest in the floor operations except as they related to metrics. His presence here now was about something else entirely. He stopped when he saw Maya. The floor around them, the nurses, the unit clerk, even a patient's adult son who happened to be standing nearby, was performing the collective act of pretending to look at other things while actually watching very closely. Hale's face went through several things in quick succession. Maya watched them pass with mild interest. "Maya," his voice was level. He was working at it. "I wasn't informed you'd been reinstated. My credentials were restored this morning." "By whose authority?" "By the authority of the individuals conducting the federal review of this facility." She held his gaze. That would be the relevant authorization. I'd like to see the documentation. That's a conversation for your legal counsel and the federal coordinator. I'm in the middle of a shift. She turned back to the monitor she had been reviewing. Is there something patient care related I can help you with? The silence that followed had a texture. Hale was used to being the person in a room who held the most institutional power, and every exchange he had ever had with Maya in this building had been shaped by that fact. He had made the decision to remove her because he believed that power was absolute and unchallenged. He was currently standing in the middle of his own hospital discovering, in front of witnesses, that something had changed. He left without another word. Dina appeared at Maya's shoulder approximately 30 seconds after he cleared the unit doors. That man, Dina said quietly, has absolutely no idea what's coming. No, Maya agreed. He doesn't. What Hale didn't know, what most of the hospital didn't know yet, was that the federal review had deepened overnight in a way that had not been in the original scope. What had begun as a patient outcome audit connected to the pharmaceutical supply chain concern had expanded because the supply chain concern had expanded. Agent Forsyth had called Maya at 6 that morning before the sun was fully up and delivered this information in the same measured tone he used for everything. The pharmaceutical discrepancies at Delwood weren't the result of shipping errors. That had been the initial working hypothesis, and it had been wrong. The pattern that the federal auditors had been mapping over the previous 2 weeks pointed toward something more deliberate, a systematic diversion of specific controlled medications through the hospital's procurement process. The medications were being logged as administered or wasted, and the corresponding patient records showed outcomes that, when modeled against the actual dosing that should have occurred, produced a very specific kind of flag. Not all patients, not even most patients, but enough, in a pattern, to be something other than accident. Maya had listened to all of it. At the end, she had asked the question she had been holding since Forsyth started speaking. How long? At minimum, 14 months, he said. Possibly longer. The documentation before that is harder to reconstruct. And Marsh is a person of significant interest in this investigation. She had sat with that for a moment. She had thought about the arrhythmia patient 4 months ago, the one she had caught in time. She had thought about Patricia Sowell breathing through a wet towel. She had thought about all the things she had documented and submitted and followed up on, all the places where her concerns had been redirected, deflected, buried under the administrative weight of a system that had been, as it turned out, not merely incompetent, but compromised. She had been more right than she knew, and the machine had tried to remove her for it. Okay, she had said, what do you need from me today? Now, at 12:30 in the afternoon, she was standing outside the medication room when she heard it, a sound that was not an alarm but that she registered before she consciously processed it, a specific quality of disruption from the direction of the corridor that connected the ICU to the step-down unit. She moved. The situation she found 20 feet down the hall was this. A patient, a man, late 60s, in a hospital gown, tethered to a rolling IV pole, had collapsed partially against the wall and was being held upright by a young nurse named Brianna, who was trying to simultaneously support the man's weight, call for help on the radio clipped to her shoulder, and keep the IV line from pulling free, and managing none of these three things particularly well because nobody could manage all three things simultaneously. Maya had the IV line secured before she said anything. She was already assessing the patient, color, responsiveness, the way his legs had buckled versus a full loss of consciousness, before the code team was summoned. Brianna, talk to me. He said he was dizzy and then just... Brianna's voice was fraying at the edges. I didn't want to let him fall. You did right. Keep his head stable. Maya pressed 2 fingers to the man's carotid. Sir, can you hear me? A groan, movement. Okay, that's good. Don't try to stand. The code team arrived in under 2 minutes. Maya delivered the handover, brief, specific, accurate, and stepped back to let them work. Brianna was against the opposite wall, still wired with adrenaline, watching the organized motion of the response team with the expression of someone who had just realized how close the margin had been. Is he going to be okay? She asked. Probably. His pressure dropped. He needs fluids and evaluation. Maya looked at her. You held him. That mattered. Brianna nodded. She looked like she might cry, and she was visibly fighting it. And Maya recognized that fight because she had fought it herself more times than she could count, and knew both how hard it was and how necessary. Go get some water, Maya told her. Then come back. I need you functional. Yes, okay. Brianna pushed off from the wall. Maya? Yeah. Why did they fire you? The question was genuine, not rhetorical, not pointed, just the honest confusion of someone young enough to still expect institutional logic to track with observable reality. Maya considered the question for a moment. Because the people who were doing the wrong things needed someone to blame for noticing, she said. It was the simplest version of the truth, and it was accurate. Brianna processed this. Then she walked toward the break room, and Maya turned back toward the unit. At 2 p.m, Agent Kellard appeared in the corridor beside Maya and said, in a voice pitched low enough that it didn't carry, "We have a development." They stepped into an empty consultation room. Forsyth had requested an emergency update to the timeline. The federal protectee whose visit had been the initiating concern for Maya's reinstatement was going to arrive earlier than scheduled. Not 48 hours from now, but 18. The reasons for the acceleration were above the level Kellard was going to describe in this room, but the practical implications were immediate. The security configuration, the medical preparation, the specific protocol that Maya had been briefed on and was the only person in this building qualified to execute. All of it needed to compress into a much tighter window. "I need to walk the floor plan with you," Kellard said. "And I need you to tell me what you're missing." Maya thought about Patricia Sowell, who still needed her parameters checked at 3 o'clock. She thought about the collapsed patient in the corridor, whose outcome she hadn't yet confirmed. She thought about the 16 other patients currently in the ICU and the 9 on the step-down unit and the specific calibration of attention required to hold all of them adequately while also preparing for something that had its own completely different order of demands. "Give me 40 minutes, she said, "and I need Dina read in." "That's a risk." Dina has been in this unit for 20 years. If something goes wrong during that visit and she doesn't know why the protocol shifted, the risk is worse. Maya held Kellard's gaze. "I know my floor." Kellard considered this for about 3 seconds. 40 minutes. Maya went back to work. She checked Patricia Sowell first. The updated parameters were holding. Patricia's breathing had improved measurably, and when she saw Maya at the bedside, she said without preamble, "You were right about the wet towel," which, under the circumstances, Maya took as close to a positive outcome as the afternoon had offered. She confirmed the corridor patient's status with the attending. Fluid resuscitation ongoing, pressure stabilizing, probable vasovagal. Not what it had looked like for the 3 seconds before the code team arrived, but close enough that the 3 seconds had mattered. She found Dina in the supply room at 2:42. She closed the door. "I need to tell you something," Maya said, "and I need you to not ask questions outside this room." Dina looked at her steadily. 20 years of ICU nursing had produced a woman who was very difficult to rattle. "Okay." Maya told her the essential parts. Not everything. The parts that Dina needed in order to do her job in the next 18 hours without inadvertently making something worse. When she finished, Dina was quiet for a moment. "Preston Marsh," she said finally. Not a question. "Yes. I've been watching that man for 6 years. Dina's voice had no particular emotion in it, which was its own kind of emotion. "I filed a report 2 years ago, different supervisor than you went through. It also went nowhere." Maya absorbed this. "I know. How many people knew this was happening?" "That's something the investigation is going to determine." Dina looked at the shelving for a moment, at the ordered rows of supplies, the inventory that her unit went through daily, and that someone had apparently been systematically manipulating for at least 14 months. "What do you need from me?" she asked. "I need you running the unit tonight exactly the way you always run it. Steady, correct, no indication to anyone on staff that anything is different." Maya paused. "And I need you to make sure Marsh doesn't touch the medication cabinet between now and 7 a.m. Dina looked at her. Something moved in her expression. Not surprise, but the confirmation of a suspicion that had lived in her for years without ever having enough form to act on. "I can manage that," she said. "I know you can." They went back to the floor. At 4:30, Preston Marsh arrived for his afternoon rounds. He was 52, with the particular bearing of a man who had been told he was exceptional for so long that exceptionalism had become indistinguishable from identity. He walked the floor with a resident trailing behind him and the expression of someone for whom the unit was a theater and everyone else was support staff. He had, in Maya's direct experience, never once asked a nurse a clinical question that wasn't structured as a statement. He saw Maya from the end of the corridor and stopped. She was standing at the nurse's station, chart in hand, exactly as she should have been. She looked up. She held his gaze for exactly long enough to communicate that she was not looking away, and then she looked back at the chart. Marsh walked toward her. He stopped at the station edge. "I heard you were reinstated." His voice had the controlled quality of someone managing a reaction. "That's correct." "Under what circumstances?" "That's a conversation for administration." She turned a page. "Did you need something patient care related, Dr. Marsh?" He stood there for a moment. She could feel the specific quality of his attention. Not the way someone looked at a person, but the way someone looked at a problem. She had been a problem for him for 4 months. She was now a different and more serious kind of problem, and some part of him understood that without knowing why. "Bed 6, he said. "Patricia Sowell. I understand the parameters were changed." They were updated to reflect her current treatment phase. Dr. Varga reviewed and signed off. I was the admitting physician. "Yes." Maya set the chart down and looked at him directly. And her baseline parameters were set against an earlier protocol that hadn't been updated since her chemotherapy regimen changed. She spent the night breathing inadequately as a result. She kept her voice clinical. Just the facts, delivered without inflection. "The issue has been corrected." Marsh's jaw tightened at the edges. "I'll want to review Varga's orders." "Of course." She picked up the chart again. "Anything else?" He left. Dina materialized at Maya's left shoulder approximately 4 seconds later. "Did you just—" Dina started. "I just documented the interaction," Maya said. "In the chart, time-stamped." She finished the note and set the stylus down. "Which is all I did." Dina looked at her for a long moment. "You've done this before," she said. "Haven't you? Not just nursing." Maya didn't answer. She didn't need to. At 6:15, with the shift beginning its turn toward evening and the natural metabolism of the unit shifting from the day's full activity toward the quieter vigilance of night, Maya's phone buzzed with a message from Kellard. 3 words. Timeline moved again. Maya read it twice. Then she looked up at the unit around her. The patients, the monitors, the nurses moving between beds, the supply room where Dina had just gone, the corridor where a man had collapsed 6 hours ago and where everything had been stabilized and where the fluorescent light at the far end was still flickering, still unrepaired, a detail so constant it had almost become invisible. Almost. She typed back, "How soon?" Kellard's response came in 11 seconds. Maya stared at the number on her screen. 6 hours. The federal protectee was arriving in 6 hours, and somewhere in this building, in a medication log, in a supply chain record, in the pattern of decisions made by a physician currently walking these floors, was evidence of something that had been harming patients for over a year. And the person who had been trying to surface that evidence had been removed and was now back, and had 6 hours to hold this unit together well enough that what needed to happen could happen safely. She put the phone in her pocket. She went to check on Patricia Sowell. And in the parking structure across the street from Delwood General, a black SUV with federal plates had just pulled into the lowest level, and a man in the passenger seat was speaking quietly into a radio. And the word he used, repeated twice, clearly, in the particular cadence of someone establishing that a situation had moved from preparation to active, was a word that meant they were no longer getting ready. They were already here. The word on the radio was meridian. Maya learned this 20 minutes later when Kellard came to the unit in person. Not urgently, not at a pace that would register to anyone watching, but with the specific, deliberate quality of someone who needed to communicate information quickly without appearing to do so. She handed Maya a single folded card. On it, in clean print, Meridian, room 412, arrive 0100, use staff elevator C. Maya read it once, folded it, and put it in her breast pocket. "Who else knows?" she asked, her voice low enough that Dina, 20 feet away at the station, couldn't catch it. "In this building. You, me, Brant." Kellard paused. "And whoever told Marsh." Maya went still. "Say that again." "We picked up a call 40 minutes ago. Marsh's cell, to a number we've been tracking as part of the supply chain thread. Kellard's expression didn't change. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. The number receiving the call is connected to a distribution contact we've been building a case around for 8 months. The thing about receiving bad information under pressure was that you had approximately 2 seconds before your body tried to react in a way that was not useful. Maya had learned this in a context that had nothing to do with hospitals. She used the 2 seconds, and then she was past it. Does Forsyth know? He's been notified. He wants the operation to continue. Kellard met her eyes. He also said the decision about Marsh is yours. What does that mean? It means you're the senior medical presence in this unit tonight. If you determine that Marsh's access to the floor constitutes a patient safety risk during the operation window, you have the authority to restrict it. Forsyth will back whatever you document. Maya thought about that for exactly as long as she could afford to. Where's Marsh now? His car is still in the physician lot. He hasn't left the building. Get Brandt to put eyes on him. Quietly. I don't want Marsh knowing he's being watched. Already requested. And pull every medication log he's touched in the last 48 hours. Cross-reference against the patient charts. She paused. I want to know if anything moved tonight that shouldn't have. Kellard nodded and went. Maya walked back to the nurse's station and stood there for a moment looking at the board. 16 names, 16 sets of conditions, 16 people who did not know and would not know what was happening in this building tonight, who were simply sick and frightened, and depending on the people around them to make the right calls. She picked up the nearest chart and got back to work. The hours between 7 and midnight in an ICU had a specific character. The day shift's accumulated energy dissipated, the evening staff settled into their rhythms, and the unit found its nighttime register. Quieter, more watchful. The monitoring taking on a different weight when there were fewer people to share it. Dina had handed off to the night charge, a nurse named Oluwaseun Adeyemi, who went by Seun, 30s, meticulous, with the kind of sustained focus that ICU night shifts required. Maya had been introduced to him briefly when she first returned to the floor. He had assessed her the way competent people assessed each other, quickly, without fanfare, and without particular deference. Maya had told Seun what she could without crossing into what she couldn't, that the unit was operating under an elevated monitoring protocol tonight, that she would be present through the early hours of the morning, that if anything changed in any patient's status, anything at all, not just the critical alerts, she needed to know immediately. He had asked one question. Is this connected to the federal people? Yes. Okay. He had gone back to his board. At 9:40, Dina called from home. Maya stepped into the consultation room to take it. I've been thinking, Dina said, without preamble. About? The Caldwell patient, February. Do you remember? Maya thought. Caldwell. February. A patient who had coded unexpectedly 2 days post-surgical had been resuscitated and had spent an additional week in the ICU. The case had been reviewed internally and attributed to a post-operative complication. Maya had not been directly involved in the case, but she had been aware of it. I remember the outcome. I was on shift that night. Dina's voice had the careful, flat quality of someone choosing each word deliberately. The medication reconciliation didn't match. I flagged it to the charge and I was told it had been reviewed and cleared. A pause. I've been thinking about that reconciliation for 2 years, Maya. I didn't know what to do with it. Who cleared it? A silence that answered the question without words. Dina. Maya kept her voice steady. I need you to write down everything you remember about that night. Times, what you saw, what you reported, who you spoke to. Don't call anyone. Don't send anything electronically. Write it by hand and keep it somewhere safe. Is it going to matter? It's going to matter enormously. Dina was quiet for a moment. You said the investigation's been going on for 8 months. At least. Then someone already knew. It wasn't a question. It was the slow arrival of a conclusion that Dina had been approaching from a long distance. Someone in this hospital already knew and let it keep happening. That's what the investigation is going to determine. How many patients, Maya? She didn't answer. She couldn't answer. Not with a number. Not yet. But the silence was its own answer, and Dina understood it. Write it down, Maya said again. Tonight. She ended the call. She sat in the consultation room for 30 seconds, alone, and allowed herself to feel the full weight of what Dina had just told her. The Caldwell patient, February, a medication reconciliation that hadn't matched, a flag that had gone nowhere, 2 years of a nurse carrying something she didn't know what to do with. She let it land. She did not push it away, because pushing things away was what created the kind of internal pressure that came out wrong at the wrong moment. Then she stood up and went back to the floor. At 11:15, Brandt sent a message to Kellard, who relayed it to Maya in 4 words. Marsh went to pharmacy. The hospital's inpatient pharmacy was on the 2nd floor, accessible to physicians through their credential ID. It was not unusual for a physician to visit pharmacy. What was unusual was visiting it at 11:15 at night during a shift he was not technically covering. Maya found Seun at the station. I need you to flag any medication order submitted under Marsh's credentials in the last 2 hours and hold it pending pharmacist verification. Seun looked at her. That's going to slow some things down. I know, do it anyway. I need a clinical justification I can document. Elevated review protocol under federal health compliance audit. She held his gaze. Document it exactly like that. I'll countersign. He nodded and turned to the screen. Maya's phone buzzed. Kellard again. Marsh is back on the floor, 3rd corridor. She walked. She found Marsh at the end of the 3rd corridor, standing outside the step-down unit with a tablet in his hand and the expression of a man who was trying to look purposeful. He looked up when she came around the corner. They were alone in the corridor. The fluorescent light near the unit entrance, a different one from the ICU, fully functional, cast a flat neutral light on both of them. Somewhere behind the step-down unit doors, a monitor was alarming briefly and then stopping, the small regular rhythm of a unit at night. Dr. Marsh, Maya stopped 8 feet away. Professional distance. What are you working on? Patient review. He held up the tablet slightly, the gesture of a man establishing legitimacy for an action. Which patient? A brief pause, barely perceptible. Dunmore, bed 14. Mr. Dunmore was discharged this afternoon. Maya watched his face. Bed 14 is empty. The pause this time was longer. Marsh lowered the tablet. Something shifted in his expression. Not fear exactly, but the particular recalibration of a person who has just understood that the conversation they thought they were having is not the conversation they are actually in. I must have the wrong room number. His voice stayed even. It cost him something. Probably. Maya kept her tone neutral. I've placed an elevated review hold on credential-based pharmacy orders for the overnight period. Anything submitted under your ID tonight will need pharmacist countersignature before it moves. She paused. I wanted to make sure you were aware so it doesn't cause any delays in your patient care. The quality of stillness that came over Preston Marsh in that moment was not the stillness of composure. It was the stillness of a person calculating, and calculating hard and not liking any of the numbers. On whose authority? He said quietly. Federal Health Compliance Review. It's documented. She held his gaze. Is there a patient you need me to assist with tonight, Dr. Marsh? He looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned and walked toward the elevator. Maya watched him go. She waited until the elevator doors closed. Then she took out her phone and typed to Kellard. He knows something changed. Watch his car. The response came in under a minute. Already on it, Forsyth wants you at 4:12 in 90 minutes. She went back to the ICU. Seun met her at the station with the expression of someone who had found something they weren't entirely sure they wanted to find. The pharmacy visit, he said. He pulled up the screen and turned it toward her. He accessed the controlled substance log, not to administer, to review, which is within his credentials. Seun's finger moved to a column of entries. But look at these access timestamps going back 3 weeks. Maya looked. The pattern was there, legible once you knew to look for it. A series of late evening access events, each one brief, each one to the same subcategory of the controlled log. Not taking, reviewing, learning the inventory. He was checking what was there, Maya said, and when it moved and by how much. Seun straightened. This is above my pay grade. No, Maya said, this is exactly your pay grade. Document what you found, timestamp it, and save it to the federal compliance folder Kellard set up this afternoon. The access code is on the card she gave Brandt. Seun processed this. Is he going to come back tonight? I don't think so. She looked at the board. But we're going to act like he might. At 12:45 in the morning, Maya took the staff elevator C to the fourth floor. Room 412 was not a patient room. It was a procedure suite that had been cleared and repurposed for the night. Furniture rearranged, equipment staged, the window blinds angled to admit light from outside without offering visibility in. Kellard was inside when Maya arrived. Two other agents, whose names she hadn't been given, were positioned in the corridor. The room was quiet in the way of a space that had been prepared, not the quiet of emptiness. Forsyth was there too, standing near the window, speaking low into a phone. He ended the call when Maya entered. The protectee arrives in 12 minutes, he said. There's been a development. Marsh made a call from the parking structure at 11:58. We recorded it. Forsyth's voice was careful. The call lasted 4 minutes. The person on the other end has been identified as a mid-tier distribution contact for a pharmaceutical diversion network we've been building a federal case against for 8 months. The conversation included references to a changed security environment at the facility and a disruption to what they called the schedule. JK, he paused. We believe tonight's visit may have moved up specifically because we anticipated an attempt to interfere with the protectee's care. Maya absorbed this. You think the diversion network knew about the visit? We think there was a leak at the scheduling level, yes, which is why the timeline was moved twice. He looked at her steadily. The individual arriving tonight has a pre-existing cardiac condition, managed and stable under normal circumstances. The specific medications required for that management have been on the Delwood pharmacy inventory. He let that sit for a moment. We need tonight to go correctly. Everything depends on the medical environment being exactly what it should be. I placed a hold on Marsh's pharmacy access. I know. That was the right call. Forsyth hesitated, which was not something she had seen him do before. Maya, there's one more thing. She waited. The diversion network, the 14 months of documentation, the Caldwell patient in February. He paused. We have reason to believe Victor Hale knew. The room was very quiet. Not the full scope, Forsyth continued. We're not certain he knew about the patient outcomes. But the pharmaceutical arrangement, the supply chain diversion, we have documentation suggesting he was aware of the financial structure, that he was compensated for not looking closely at the pharmacy audit. Maya stood with this information for a moment. She thought about the office on the fourth floor, the styrofoam coffee cup, the file that had been built against her, complaint by complaint, accommodation by accommodation, as she had kept reporting what she found. She thought about how institutional corruption was almost never one person doing one dramatic thing. It was usually 10 people doing small, manageable things that added up to something nobody wanted to look at directly. Okay, she said. Okay? Okay. I have the full picture now. She looked at Forsyth. What do you need me to do in the next 12 minutes? He told her. She listened to everything. When he finished, she asked 2 questions. He answered both. She turned to the equipment staged along the wall. The monitoring setup, the emergency kit, the specific medications she had pre-verified 2 hours ago, and she began to check it, moving through each item with the particular efficiency of someone who had done pre-mission equipment checks in conditions that made this room feel very still and very safe. One of the unnamed agents watched her do this. How long were you in? He asked. She didn't look up from the kit. Long enough. What unit? The kind that doesn't have a name on a base. He was quiet for a moment, then, good to have you here. Don't thank me yet, she said. She closed the kit. The night's not over. At 1:03 in the morning, the elevator at the end of the 4th floor corridor opened, and 3 people stepped out. 2 were agents. The third was a woman in her late 60s, silver-haired in civilian clothes, moving with the careful, deliberate pace of someone managing a physical limitation they had long since made peace with. Maya had been briefed on her condition. She had reviewed the medication list, the cardiac history, the most recent labs that Forsyth had transmitted from a federal medical file. She knew, in the clinical sense, exactly who this woman was in terms of what her body needed and what it could not tolerate. She was not prepared entirely for the way the woman looked at her when they were introduced. Not recognition, she didn't know Maya, but something assessing and clear, the look of someone who had spent decades reading the quality of the people in front of her and was doing it now out of habit. "You're the nurse," the woman said. "Yes, ma'am. They told me about you, about what was done to you here." She looked at Maya with a directness that didn't soften. "I'm sorry that happened." Maya held her gaze. "Let's make sure tonight goes well," she said. "That'll be enough." The woman almost smiled. "All right," she said. "Let's do that." The check took 22 minutes. Vitals, ECG, medication review, a brief physical assessment that required both precision and a kind of deliberate calm that Maya had learned, not in nursing school, not in the ICU, but in the particular conditions of a different kind of service, was its own medical tool. She moved through it without rushing and without the performance of urgency. Everything was stable. Everything held. At 1:31, Maya stepped out of room 412 into the corridor and leaned briefly against the wall. The corridor was empty except for one agent at each end. The building around her was at its quietest point of the night. Her phone buzzed. "Seun." Marcia's badge just accessed the stairwell on floor 2, heading up. Maya pushed off the wall. She was moving before the next message arrived, and the next message arrived 8 seconds later, and it was not from Seun. It was from Brandt, the head of security, and it contained 4 words that arrived in the corridor like a door slamming open in a quiet house. "Marsh has a pharmacy bag." She was already texting Keelard as she moved. "Marsh stairwell, floor 2, heading up, pharmacy bag, intercept now." The response came in 4 seconds. "On it. Hold position." She didn't hold position. She understood the operational logic of holding position. She was the medical asset. The protectee was in 412. Her job was to stay between the two. She understood all of that. She also understood, in the way that came from having made time-critical decisions in conditions far worse than this corridor, that Marsh with a pharmacy bag heading toward the 4th floor was not a situation that resolved itself while she waited. She went to the stairwell door at the end of the 4th floor corridor and pushed it open. The stairwell was concrete and fluorescent and very quiet. She could hear footsteps below, 1 flight down, maybe 2, moving upward with the particular cadence of someone trying to be deliberate without being slow. She positioned herself at the landing between the 3rd and 4th floors, back against the wall, and waited. Marsh came around the turn 30 seconds later. He stopped when he saw her. He was in his white coat, which was unusual for this hour, and he was carrying a pharmacy bag. White paper, sealed at the top, the kind used for patient prescription transfers. His face, in the stairwell light, was doing several things at once, and none of them were the composed authority he had been projecting for the last 24 hours. "Dr. Marsh," her voice was flat and even, bouncing slightly off the concrete. "I need you to set that bag on the step. This is a patient medication delivery." His voice was holding, but just. "Which patient?" I'm not required to set the bag on the step." He looked at her. He looked past her, up the stairwell toward the 4th floor door. He looked back at her face and found nothing there that was going to move. The bag went on the step. The stairwell door above them opened and 2 federal agents came through it, and the stairwell became a very different kind of space. One agent went to the bag. The other positioned himself at Marsh's shoulder without touching him, which was its own kind of communication. Marsh's composure came apart in stages. First his hands, which found each other and pressed tight. Then his breathing, which changed register. Then something in his face, not guilt, not yet, but the specific expression of a man who had spent years managing his exposure and had just understood that the management was over. The agent with the bag looked at the contents. He looked at Maya. "Metoprolol succinate," he said, 200 milligrams. Extended release. He held up the label. "Patient name is Dunmore, T." "Dunmore was discharged this afternoon," Maya said. "Bed 14 is empty." The agent looked at Marsh. Marsh said nothing. The metoprolol in that bag, 200 milligrams of extended-release beta-blocker, was twice the standard dose for a patient in cardiac management. Delivered to someone with an existing cardiac condition whose body was already managing the medication at therapeutic levels, it would not look like poisoning. It would look like a complication. An unexpected drop in heart rate. A blood pressure event that the medical staff would respond to urgently, that would require intervention, that in the chaotic environment of an emergency response might allow other things to happen, other medications to be drawn, Other decisions to be made in the compressed and uncertain minutes of a code. Maya understood all of this in about 4 seconds, standing in the stairwell, looking at that bag. She had been right to move. Kellard arrived 30 seconds after the agents, through the lower stairwell door, moving fast and then very controlled when she assessed the situation. She looked at the bag. She looked at Maya. She looked at Marsh, who had started to say something about his legal rights, and was doing it without conviction, the words coming out already hollow. "Dr. Preston Marsh," Kellard said, "you are being detained in connection with an active federal investigation. You have the right to remain silent." She continued through the full recitation with the particular rhythm of someone who had done it many times and was doing it now with specific, deliberate clarity because the recording needed to be clean. Marsh listened. His mouth was slightly open. He had the look of a man watching the distance between where he was and where he had thought he was collapse all at once. "I want my attorney," he said when Kellard finished. "That'll be arranged," she said. "Step this way, please." They took him out through the lower stairwell. Maya stayed on the landing for a moment. The stairwell was quiet again. The bag was being handled and logged. The footsteps receded. She breathed, once, through her nose and out through her mouth, the specific technique she had learned in a context that felt very far away and was, in this moment, very close. Then she went back to room 412. The woman inside was awake and sitting up, which she hadn't been when Maya left. The agent near the door had clearly briefed her on the general nature of the activity in the corridor because she looked at Maya with the expression of someone who had processed information and was waiting for the direct version. "Was it the physician?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am." "The one your investigation has been building toward?" "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. Her hands were folded in her lap with a stillness that Maya recognized as the practiced composure of someone who had spent years receiving information in rooms and giving nothing back until they chose to. "Is the building secure?" "It is now." Maya moved to the monitoring equipment. "I'd like to run another set of vitals." "Of course." The woman extended her arm without being asked. "The bag," she said, while Maya wrapped the cuff. "What was in it?" Maya told her. The woman absorbed this with a slowness that was not confusion. She was thinking, fully and precisely. He was going to make it look like a complication. That's the working theory. And if it had worked, if I had reacted badly overnight, the response would have been chaotic enough that, yes, the cuff reading came back. 118/74. Good. Steady. Maya logged it and checked the ECG lead. 14 months, the woman said quietly. That's how long this diversion has been running? At minimum. How many patients? The investigation is still mapping that. The answer is not small. The woman looked at the window. The blinds were angled, and the Carver City nightscape showed through in thin strips. The parking structure lights, the street below, the ambient glow of a city that had no idea what was happening on the 4th floor of its hospital. The nurse who was fired, she said. That was you. Yes. And you came back anyway. Maya checked the lead placement. I came back because there were patients who needed someone paying attention. That's not all of it. She looked up. The woman was watching her with the particular directness of someone who had long since given up the performance of tact when precision was more useful. No, Maya said. It's not all of it. She straightened. Everything looks stable. Try to sleep if you can. I'll be outside. The woman nodded. Then, what's going to happen to the CEO? Hale. That depends on what the investigation finds. Forsyth believes he was aware of the financial arrangement, but not the patients. We don't know yet. The woman considered this. The difference matters legally, she said. It doesn't change the outcome for the patients. No, Maya agreed. It doesn't. She went out into the corridor. At 2:40 in the morning, Forsyth called. He was no longer in the building. He had been coordinating from a vehicle in the parking structure since midnight, and his voice on the phone had the focused, efficient quality of someone who had been awake for a very long time and was managing it. Marsh is in federal custody. His attorney has been notified. A pause. The pharmacy bag has been logged and is in chain of custody. The metoprolol was not standard issue from Delwood Pharmacy. The lot number traces back to a batch that was diverted from the hospital's controlled supply 8 weeks ago. logged as administered to a patient who was discharged before the supposed administration date. So he'd been holding it. For the right moment. Forsyth's voice was careful. We also got into his car. There was a second phone, burner, wiped, but the last call wasn't fully deleted. Same number as the call from the parking structure. The distribution contact, who is now also in custody in a separate location. They're not talking to each other. He paused. The network we've been building toward for 8 months. Marsh was not peripheral to it. He was a primary access point. The hospital was the supply source. Maya was standing in the corridor with the phone pressed to her ear, and the particular stillness of someone receiving information that confirmed what they had understood but had not yet had confirmed. How many hospitals? Delwood is the one we can document. There may be others. The investigation will determine that. And Hale. A pause that told her the answer before he gave it. His personal financial records show a series of payments, consulting fees structured through a shell company, that correspond in timing with the expansion of the diversion operation. We don't have a recorded conversation. We have a financial pattern that a federal prosecutor will find very interesting. Does he know you have it? He will in approximately 4 hours. Forsyth paused. His attorney is going to receive a notification at 7 a.m. We wanted the protectee's visit to conclude and the facility secured before that happened. Maya looked down the corridor toward the elevator, the agents at each end, the quiet of a building at 3 a.m. What about Dina Trofimov's report from the Caldwell incident? It's been formally received into evidence. The original complaint she filed 2 years ago, we found it in a physical archive. It was redirected from the nursing supervisor to Hale's administrative assistant and never forwarded to the appropriate committee. She thought about Dina, at home right now, writing things down by hand, carrying something she'd held alone for 2 years. I want that documented in the investigation record, Maya said, by name. It will be. She ended the call. She spent the next 2 hours on the 4th floor, checking the monitoring equipment on the hour, coordinating quietly with Seyun on the ICU status 2 floors below. The unit had been steady through the night. Patricia Sowell was sleeping, and her oxygen saturation had held in the normal range for 6 hours straight. The corridor patient from earlier in the day, the vasovagal collapse, had been moved to a step-down bed and was stable. The 16 people whose names were on the ICU board had made it through the night without a crisis, which was not guaranteed and was not nothing. At 4:55 in the morning, the protectee's departure was arranged. Maya was present for the transit from room 412 to the elevator, which took approximately 90 seconds and was conducted with the quiet, coordinated movement of people who had planned it carefully. The woman paused at the elevator and looked at Maya. You should know, she said, that what you documented, the Marsh reports, the incident logs, all of it, has been placed directly into the federal investigation file. Your name is attached to every entry. She held Maya's eyes. That record isn't going to disappear. I know. I'm going to make sure you know it officially. She stepped into the elevator. Thank you, Maya. The doors closed. Maya stood in the corridor. She was tired in a way that was mostly physical now, which was cleaner than the other kind. The adrenaline of the stairwell was metabolized and gone, leaving the bone-level exhaustion of a person who had been running on vigilance for 48 hours. She would sleep eventually. Not yet. She took the elevator down to the ICU. Seyun was at the station, doing chart reviews with the careful attention of someone in hour 9 of a 12-hour shift. He looked up when she came in. Everything held, he said. I saw. She sat down at the adjacent terminal. The Marsh Pharmacy hold. Keep it active until administration formally contacts you. Don't lift it on your own authority. Understood. He paused. Is he coming back? No. Seyun nodded slowly. Something in his expression settled. Not relief exactly, but the particular adjustment of someone who had been holding extra tension all night and was now allowing it to release. I've been here 4 years, he said. I always thought the pharmacy numbers seemed off. I said it once, early on. My supervisor told me I was misreading the logs. Were you? No. He looked at the screen. But I didn't push it. I had a family, a mortgage. I told myself I was probably wrong. He paused. I wasn't wrong. No, Maya said. You weren't. They sat with that for a moment in the particular way of people in an ICU at 5 in the morning, where the weight of things was different than it was in the daylight. At 6:45, Victor Hale arrived at the hospital. This was earlier than his usual time. He typically came in between 8 and 8:30, the arrival of a man who wanted to be present for the beginning of the day's administrative activity without being present for the parts that required physical endurance. His early arrival this morning was, Maya would later learn, because his attorney had reached him at home at 6:15 with information about the night's events that had made sitting in his house feel untenable. He came through the lobby in the particular way of a man trying to project that everything was under control, which was recognizable precisely because it was trying. He took the elevator to the 4th floor. He walked to his office. He opened his door. Daniel Forsyth was sitting in the chair across from his desk. 2 federal agents were positioned near the window. Hale stood in the doorway. "Good morning, Mr. Hale," Forsyth said. He did not get up. "Please come in. Close the door." Hale's attorney arrived 11 minutes later. His name was Gordon Welch, an experienced health law attorney who had been representing hospital administrators for 25 years, and who walked into Hale's office with the composed authority of someone who had managed federal inquiries before. He reviewed the documentation Forsyth provided with the focused attention of a man reading a situation accurately. When he finished, he set the papers down. He looked at his client. Hale was sitting behind his own desk, which should have given him the psychological positioning of a person on familiar ground. It didn't. He had the particular quality of a man who has understood, in the last 30 minutes, that the situation he thought he was managing had been beyond his management for a very long time. "We'll need time to review," Welch said to Forsyth. "Of course." Forsyth closed his folder. "Mr. Hale, I want to be transparent about where the investigation stands. Dr. Preston Marsh was taken into federal custody at approximately 2:05 this morning. The pharmaceutical diversion operation he was central to has been documented over a 14-month period. The financial records connecting the operation to administrative decisions within this facility are part of the federal case file." He paused. "We are prepared to discuss the nature of your cooperation, should you choose to engage with that conversation." Welch put a hand on his client's arm. Hale said nothing, but his hands, resting on the desk in front of him, the same desk where he had fired Maya Reeves with a coffee cup in his hand and not enough respect to stand up, were not steady. The news moved through the hospital the way hospital news always moved, not through official announcement, but through the organic transmission of people who knew things, telling people who didn't, adjusted and partially accurate, and arriving everywhere simultaneously. By 7:30, the nursing staff knew that Marsh had been detained overnight. By 8, the story had acquired the federal investigation context. By 8:30, when the day shift was coming on and the night shift was giving handover, the ICU nurses were talking about it at the station in the low, compressed voices of people processing something significant. Brianna was on day shift. She came in at 7:50, got her assignment, and found Maya still at the terminal doing documentation. "Is it true?" she asked. Maya looked up. "Some of it's true. I'd wait for official information before filling in the parts you don't know. They're saying Marsh was arrested. He was detained for federal questioning. That's accurate." Brianna absorbed this. She was young enough that her face was still in the phase where things showed clearly. She looked like someone who was feeling several things at once and wasn't sure which one was the right response. "The patient in February," she said. "Caldwell. I was a student here when that happened. Everyone said it was just a complication." "I know." "Was it?" Maya looked at her for a moment. "That's part of what the investigation is going to determine." She kept her voice even. "What I can tell you is that the person who raised concerns about that case, and about the cases before it and after it, was doing the right thing, and the institution's response to that person was not." Brianna was quiet. Then, "And they fired you for it?" "Yes." "And now you're back." "Right now I'm finishing my documentation," Maya said, "so that whoever takes over this terminal has accurate records." She turned back to the screen. "That's the job? That's always the job." Brianna went to her assignment. At 9:20, Forsyth appeared in the ICU doorway. He looked the way Maya expected him to look after a night like the one they had all come through. controlled and functional, running on whatever federal agents ran on when sleep wasn't an option. He met Maya's eyes and tilted his head toward the consultation room. She followed him in. Hale's attorney has indicated he's willing to cooperate with the investigation, Forsyth said, in exchange for the federal team's consideration of his level of involvement versus Marsh's. What does his cooperation involve? Documentation of the arrangement, how it was structured, who approached whom. Forsyth paused. He's going to claim he didn't know about the patient care dimension, that he understood it as a financial arrangement between Marsh and outside contacts and believed the medications being diverted were excess inventory. That's not how pharmacy diversion works. No, it isn't. Forsyth looked at her. His attorney knows that. Hale knows that. The cooperation offer is about reducing his exposure, not eliminating it. He folded his hands. The hospital board has been notified of the federal investigation. They're convening an emergency session this afternoon. Maya thought about the board. She had appeared before them once, 3 years ago, as part of a quality improvement presentation. She had found them competent in the way that oversight boards were often competent, attentive to the information in front of them, limited by the information they chose to receive. Does the board know Hale was informed of my original patient safety reports? They will by this afternoon. All of it. The Marsh documentation I submitted, the Trofimov incident, the original complaint chain, the evidence that my submissions were received by administration and not forwarded. She paused. The board needs to understand that this was not a single bad actor. This was a system that was managed to protect a bad actor, and the management involved suppressing patient safety reporting at multiple levels. Forsyth looked at her for a moment. I'll make sure the full picture is presented. I need more than that. She held his eyes. I need the board to receive this from me, directly, not summarized. He considered this. That can be arranged? Today, she said. Today, he confirmed. She went back to the floor. The board convened at 2 p.m. in the 6th floor conference room. Maya had never been in it before. It was the kind of room that communicated its own importance through size and furniture. A long table, high-backed chairs, a view of Carver City's modest skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows. 12 board members. The board chair, a woman named Adeze Nwofor, who had a background in healthcare law, and the particular expression of someone who had been managing a crisis since 6 a.m. and had not yet reached the end of it. Forsyth presented first. He laid out the federal investigation in clear and sequential language, beginning with the initiation of the audit the previous spring, and ending with Marsh's detention and Hale's cooperation agreement. He was factual and complete and gave the board exactly what they needed to understand the scope without editorializing. Then he said, I'd like the board to hear from Nurse Maya Reeves directly. Nwofor looked at Maya. Please. Maya stood. She did not have notes. She did not need them. She spoke for 14 minutes. She described what she had observed and documented over the 14 months prior to her termination. She described the Marsh reports, dates, patient identifiers, the specific clinical concerns she had raised and the responses she had received. She described the Trofimov incident, with Dina's name and the date and the 2-year silence that had followed. She described her termination, the file that had been built, the framing of her concerns as conduct issues, the morning in Hale's office with the coffee cup on the desk. She did not editorialize. She did not allow anger into the language. She described what happened, in order, accurately. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. One of the board members, a physician, she could tell by the specific nature of his attention, said, the Caldwell patient, the February incident, the reconciliation discrepancy, was reported by a senior ICU nurse and redirected to the CEO's office rather than the patient safety committee, Maya said. I have the documentation chain. The board member looked at Forsyth. Forsyth confirmed it. Nwofor was writing. She had been writing throughout. She set the pen down and looked at Maya with a directness that was not hostile and not apologetic. It was the look of someone about to say something she knew was insufficient but needed to say anyway. The board owes you an accounting, Nwofor said. We will be conducting a full internal review in parallel with the federal investigation. That review will include the handling of every patient safety report submitted to this administration over the last 3 years. She paused. And it will include an immediate review of your termination. I'd like the termination rescinded formally, Maya said, with a documented record of the patient safety concerns I raised being validated by the federal investigation. That will happen. Nuofor paused. Is there anything else you need us to understand? Maya looked around the table. 12 people who held governance responsibility for this institution and who had, by failing to look closely at the information available to them, allowed a structure of harm to operate inside it for over a year. Yes, she said. There are nurses in this building who reported concerns and were managed into silence. Dina Trofimov, Seun Adeyemi, Brianna. I don't have her last name on record yet, but she's been here 4 years and she flagged discrepancies as a student that were dismissed. She kept her voice level. When this investigation is documented, those names need to be in the record, not as witnesses, as people who did their jobs correctly and were not supported by this institution in doing so. Nuofor wrote the names. Victor Hale's chair at the head of the administrative table was empty. He was, at that moment, 2 buildings away in a federal office, with his attorney beside him and a cooperation agreement in front of him that he was going to sign because the alternative was worse, going through the implications of what he had set in motion on the morning he fired a nurse he had never understood. The board meeting ended at 4:15. Maya took the elevator back to the ICU. She had been awake for 34 hours. She knew this the way she knew the medication doses on the board in front of her. As a fact, precise and relevant. She would need to sleep. She would need, at some point, to sit somewhere that wasn't a hospital and let the last 2 days process into something she could actually hold. Not yet. Seun was at the station doing handover prep for the evening shift. He looked up when she came in. How did it go? It went. She sat down. Your name is in the board record. You flagged discrepancies 4 years ago and were dismissed. That's documented now. Seun was quiet for a moment. Something moved in his face that was not quite what she expected. Not satisfaction, not relief. Something older. My supervisor at the time told me I was going to make problems for myself if I kept pushing on things I didn't understand, he said. She was wrong. She retired 6 months later. She's probably fine. He paused. Are we fine? The unit. The unit is standing, Maya said. That's what we can say right now. She pulled up the patient board and began to review it. She was on the 3rd chart when Kellard appeared at the unit entrance and caught her eye with a look that communicated, there's something else. Maya stood and went to the doorway. Kellard was holding a tablet. On it was a document, several pages, federal letterhead. The investigation records from the supply chain audit, Kellard said. She turned the tablet toward Maya. We've been tracking the distribution contact that Marsh called, the one in custody. She pointed to a line in the document. He gave us the full network structure this morning. Every hospital access point, every diversion log, every financial transaction. She paused. He also gave us the name of the person who first introduced Marsh to the network. Maya looked at the name on the screen. It was not a name she recognized. Then Kellard scrolled down, and on the next page was a photograph. A security image, grainy but legible, from what appeared to be a parking structure. 2 men, one was Marsh, the other was someone Maya had never seen before. Who is he? She asked. That's what makes this complicated, Kellard said. He's a former senior administrator, retired from hospital management 5 years ago. She looked at Maya. He consulted for 7 hospital systems before his retirement. Delwood was one of them. She paused. The other 6 are currently being contacted by federal investigators. Maya looked at the photograph. This isn't just Delwood, she said. No, Kellard said. It never was. The man in the photograph had a name. Raymond Caulfield. Kellard gave Maya the rest of it standing in the ICU doorway, her voice low and her words chosen with the efficiency of someone who understood that the person she was briefing did not need context padded around the facts. Caulfield was 63, retired, and had spent the last decade building what appeared from the outside to be a consulting practice advising hospital systems on operational efficiency. What it had actually been was a network, carefully structured, deliberately obscured, that identified institutional vulnerabilities in hospital pharmaceutical supply chains and connected those vulnerabilities to a distribution operation that had been moving diverted controlled medications into secondary markets for 7 years. 7 years. Not 14 months. not the scope they had been mapping at Delwood General. 7 years across multiple facilities, each one approached through a physician contact, each one generating a quiet and consistent financial return for everyone inside the structure who had chosen to look away from what was happening. Delwood was not the origin. It was one node in something larger, and Marsh had been the access point, and Hale had been the administrator who had made sure the right doors stayed unlocked. Maya looked at the photograph for a long moment. Then she handed the tablet back to Kellard. "The other 6 hospital systems," she said. "Federal investigators contacted all 6 this morning. 4 have opened internal reviews. 2 are cooperating directly with the investigation." Kellard paused. "Caulfield was picked up at his home in Virginia at 6:40 this morning. He's in federal custody." "Has he talked?" "His attorney has advised him not to, but the distribution contact gave us enough that it doesn't matter." Kellard looked at her. "The case is built, Maya. What's left now is the documentation and the proceedings." Maya nodded. She looked at the ICU board behind her. The names, the vitals, the current status of 16 people who had needed someone paying attention through a very long night. "Then I'm going to finish my shift," she said. She did. She worked through until 6 in the evening, when the day shift had fully handed to the afternoon team, and there was nothing left on her task list that hadn't been addressed. She checked Patricia Sowell, who was sitting up and eating a small meal, and who said, when she saw Maya, "There she is," in the tone of someone who had been waiting. She reviewed every chart on the board. She countersigned Seyoon's night documentation and wrote her own summary entries with the careful precision of someone who understood that clinical records were also institutional memory, and institutional memory was one of the things that had been deliberately corrupted in this building for over a year. When she finally signed out and collected her bag from the locker room, she stood at the sink for a moment and looked at her reflection. She looked the way 36 hours without sleep looked, which was not cinematic, not composed, but tired in the specific way of a person who had spent all of their reserves and was now running on the awareness that it was finally, actually, over enough to stop. She drove home. She slept for 11 hours. She woke at 6 in the morning to 14 missed messages, and the particular quality of light through her window that meant it was going to be a cold, clear day. She made coffee before she read any of them. The messages were from Dina, Seyoon, Brianna, 2 nurses she had worked with for years and not spoken to since her termination, a former colleague from a previous position, Forsyth, Kellard, her sister in Atlanta, who had clearly heard something through channels Maya hadn't tracked, and Adeze Nwofor's office assistant, requesting a call at her earliest convenience. She called Nwofor first. The board had met again the previous evening, an emergency continuation of the afternoon session. The vote had been unanimous. Victor Hale's position as CEO of Delwood General Hospital was terminated, effective immediately, pending the outcome of the federal proceedings and the internal review. His termination letter had been delivered to his attorney at 9:15 p.m. Maya's termination had been formally rescinded. Her personnel file had been corrected. Her patient safety reports, every one of them, dating back 11 months to the first Marsh flag, had been reviewed by the board's compliance committee overnight and validated. The record would reflect that her concerns had been accurate, properly documented, and improperly handled by hospital administration. "There will be a formal process," Nwofor said, "for addressing the full scope of what happened here. That process will take months, possibly longer." Her voice was careful and direct. "But I want you to hear from me personally that what was done to you was wrong, and that the board's failure to have oversight structures that caught this sooner is something we will be accounting for." "I appreciate that," Maya said. She was sitting at her kitchen table with the coffee in front of her. "I need it in writing." "You'll have it today." "And the other nurses? Trofimov, Adeyemi, their reports need to be formally acknowledged, not as part of a general statement, individually." "That's already being drafted." A pause. "Is there anything else?" Maya thought. "The Caldwell family," she said. "February. Someone needs to reach out to them, not as liability management, as an honest accounting of what happened." Nwofor was quiet for a moment. "That's a conversation the board will need to have with legal counsel." "I know. I'm not telling you how to conduct it. I'm telling you it needs to happen." She picked up the coffee. "The family deserves to know the truth, whatever the legal implications of that are, and I understand they're complicated, The truth is still what's owed. Another pause. I'll bring it to the board. Thank you. She ended the call and sat for a moment with the quiet of her apartment, the topographical map on the wall, the photograph of 8 people on a tailgate in flat white light, the coffee going slightly cool in the mug. She called Dina next. Dina picked up on the second ring, which meant she had been waiting. I heard, Dina said before Maya could speak. About Hale. Yes. And about my report from February. A pause. They acknowledged it. In writing, and it'll be part of the federal record. Maya paused. You held that for 2 years. I didn't know what else to do with it. Dina's voice had the quality of something being carefully put down after being carried too long. I kept thinking, maybe I was wrong. Maybe I misread it. Maybe the supervisor was right, and it had been reviewed and I just didn't understand the outcome. You weren't wrong. I know that now. A silence. I knew it then too. That was the problem. Maya understood this. The particular corrosion of knowing something and being managed into doubting the knowing. It was one of the more precise forms of institutional harm, the kind that left no visible mark and was very hard to document. What happens now? Dina asked. For the hospital, the investigation continues. For us, Maya paused. We come back in. We do the work. We make sure the people coming in after us have a unit worth coming into. That's it? That's a lot, Maya said. Don't underestimate how much that is. Dina laughed, briefly, a little rough, the laugh of someone coming down from something long and grinding. Okay, she said. Okay, I'll see you on shift. See you on shift. The next call was Forsyth. He was already in a different city. She could tell by the ambient sound on the line, the particular acoustic signature of an airport or a federal building she didn't know. The Caulfield proceedings are going to be federal, he said. The Marsh case will likely be prosecuted jointly. Federal charges for the pharmaceutical diversion, and the state medical board is initiating its own review of his licensure. He paused. Based on what the distribution contact provided, the diversion across all 7 hospital systems involved over $4 million in controlled medications over 7 years. The patient harm assessment is still being compiled. How do you compile that? Maya asked. She genuinely wanted to know. The mechanics of accounting for harm that had been deliberately made invisible. Carefully, Forsyth said, and not perfectly. Some of it we'll never be able to reconstruct with certainty. Outcomes that might have been different, complications that might not have occurred. The uncertainty is part of the damage. He paused. You'll be asked to provide a formal witness statement for the federal proceedings. I know. I'll do it. There may also be a congressional committee inquiry. This kind of systemic vulnerability in hospital pharmaceutical supply chains, it's not something that resolves with criminal proceedings alone. There are policy questions. If they want me there, I'll be there. I'll pass that along. Forsyth paused. Maya, what you did 2 nights ago, the stairwell, the hold on Marsh's credentials, the protectee's visit. The outcome of that night depended on decisions you made in real time under significant pressure. I had good information and I used it. You had partial information and you filled in the rest correctly. He paused. That's not a small thing. She looked at the photograph on her wall. 8 people squinting against white light, a tailgate, a place she hadn't been in a long time and would never return to because that chapter had closed in ways that were permanent, but that had made her into someone who could do what she had done in a hospital stairwell at 1:30 in the morning and not hesitate. Take care of yourself, Daniel, she said. You too. She hung up. She showered. She ate actual food for the first time in a day and a half. Eggs, toast, the mundane nutritional accounting of a body that had been running on adrenaline and was now requesting something more sustainable. She sat at the table and went through the rest of her messages methodically, responding to each one with the specific brevity of a person who did not want to perform the events of the last 48 hours through recounting them repeatedly. Her sister Janelle called at 9. Janelle was 44, a high school principal in Atlanta, 4 years older than Maya, and built from the same material in a different configuration. Where Maya had gone quiet and internal, Janelle had gone warm and expansive, and the combination had always produced the particular chemistry of sisters who were genuinely different people who nonetheless understood each other completely. I saw something online, Janelle said, about the hospital, about a federal investigation. I didn't know if you were involved, and then I thought, of course you're involved. I was involved. Are you okay? Maya thought about this honestly. I'm tired. I'm okay. That's not a full answer. It's an accurate one. She paused. It went right, Janelle. As right as something like this can go. Did they fire you before all this? Yes. And now? And now it's been reversed. In writing. She paused. The things I was reporting on for almost a year, they were right. The investigation confirmed all of it. Janelle was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had the particular quality of someone who is working to hold multiple things simultaneously. I remember when you first took that job. You called me and said the unit was a mess, but the patients were good, and you thought you could do something there. I did say that. You were right. Eventually, Maya looked at the window, the cold, clear light of the November morning, the street below coming into its ordinary rhythm. It took a while. How long have you been fighting this? Since I got there. She paused. I don't think I'd call it fighting. I'd call it refusing to stop seeing what I saw. Janelle was quiet again. Then, the military thing, does this have anything to do with what you did before? Maya had never told Janelle the full scope of her service. She had told her the broad shape, the army, the medical work, the deployments, the particular kind of training that had preceded all of it. The details that weren't hers to share, she hadn't shared. It prepared me, she said simply, for knowing how to function when things are moving faster than the official structure can manage. You never talk about it. No. Why? Maya thought about this honestly. Because the people who need to know what I know are the people in front of me, she said. My patients don't need my history. They need me present. That's always been enough. Janelle absorbed this. Come visit, she said, when this is over enough. It's over enough now. Maya almost smiled. Soon. She spent the next several days in the specific administrative aftermath of an institutional reckoning, which turned out to be, in its own way, as demanding as the crisis itself, just with more paperwork and fewer moments of acute adrenaline. She met with the federal investigators twice to provide her formal witness account. She met with the board's compliance committee 3 times. She sat with a state nursing board representative who was conducting a parallel review of the institutional handling of nursing safety reports at Dellwood General, and she walked that representative through the documentation she had kept. Every report, every follow-up, every response that had redirected her concern into an administrative dead end. She was careful in all of these meetings to be what she had always tried to be in high-pressure situations, accurate, specific, and without theater. She was not performing vindication. She was not allowing the legitimate satisfaction of being right to color the record she was providing. The record needed to be as clean as it could be, because the record was what would matter when the proceedings moved forward and she was no longer in the room. Preston Marsh's medical license was suspended by the state medical board on a Friday, 11 days after his detention. The suspension was pending the outcome of the criminal proceedings, which the federal prosecutors had indicated would include charges of pharmaceutical diversion, conspiracy, and healthcare fraud. His attorney had issued a statement that said the usual things statements issued in these circumstances said. Marsh himself said nothing publicly. Maya heard, through Dina, that he had moved out of his house in the 2 weeks following his detention, to where nobody on the hospital floor knew or particularly wanted to speculate. Victor Hale hired a second attorney. The cooperation agreement his first attorney had initiated was in process, which meant he was providing information about the financial structure of the arrangement in exchange for federal consideration of his level of criminal exposure. What this meant, in practice, was that he was explaining in documented detail how he had known and what he had done and what he had chosen not to look at, and the exercise of explaining it was requiring him to confront, repeatedly and in clinical legal language, the distance between the administrator he had believed himself to be and the one he had actually been. Maya did not feel sorry for him. She had examined this response in herself, honestly, because she was not a person who was comfortable with unchecked satisfaction at another person's suffering, even a person who had done real harm. She found that what she felt was not satisfaction and not sorry. It was something more like the quiet, functional acknowledgement of a correct outcome. He had done damage. The damage was being accounted for. That was what justice looked like when it worked, which was not dramatic and was not clean and was not the way anyone would write it if they were trying to make it feel like resolution. It felt like resolution anyway, imperfectly, correctly. Raymond Caulfield's federal charges were announced publicly 3 weeks after his arrest. They included 7 counts of healthcare fraud, conspiracy to commit pharmaceutical diversion, and racketeering. The network he had built across 7 hospital systems had been, by the federal prosecutor's preliminary accounting, responsible for the diversion of over $4 million in controlled medications, with documented patient harm events at 3 of the 7 facilities currently under review. When the charges were announced, they were covered by a national news outlet, and the story ran with the general shape of an institutional corruption case. The network, the physicians, the administrative complicity. Maya's name appeared in the coverage as a nurse whose patient safety reporting had initiated the institutional investigation. The coverage was accurate. It was also necessarily incomplete, because the full shape of what had happened over the last several weeks inside Delwood General was not something a news article could hold. She read it once. Then she put her phone down and went to work. The thing about coming back to a unit that had been through what the Delwood ICU had been through was that the work was the same. This was both the comfort and the demand of it. The patients did not know about Marsh or Hale or Caulfield or the $4 million or the 7 hospital systems. They knew they were sick. They knew they needed someone to pay attention. The monitors beeped with the same indifference to institutional drama that they had always beeped with, and the medication schedules ran on the same intervals, and the night shift handed to the day shift with the same compressed exchange of essential information that it always had. Maya found this, unexpectedly, to be the thing that stabilized her most. Patricia Sowell was discharged on a Wednesday, 3 weeks after the night Maya had updated her baseline parameters, and called Simon Varga and held the thread of her care through a night that had been carrying several other threads simultaneously. She stopped by the nurse's station on her way out, in street clothes, moving with more ease than she had been on admission. She found Maya at the terminal. "I wanted to say something," Patricia said. "You don't have to." "I know I don't." She stood there for a moment with the particular composure of someone who had spent time recently thinking about what they wanted to say and wanted to say it correctly. "When you came in that first morning, I'd been in that bed for 12 hours and nobody had said out loud that my breathing wasn't right. You said it in about 4 minutes. The parameters needed updating. You knew something was wrong before you updated the parameters." Patricia met her eyes. "I've been in hospitals before. I know what it looks like when someone's going through the motions and when someone's actually looking." She paused. "You were actually looking." Maya held her gaze. "That's the job." "No," Patricia said gently. "That's you." She picked up her bag. "Thank you." She left. Maya sat with that for a moment. She did not allow herself the full weight of it right then, because she was on shift and there were 15 other names on the board, and the work did not pause for the moments when something landed correctly. But she noted it, the way she had learned to note things, not pushing it away, not inflating it, just placing it somewhere internal where it would be accessible later, when she was somewhere private and could let it mean what it meant. Brianna came to Maya's elbow 45 minutes later with the tentative quality of someone who had been working toward a conversation for several days. "Can I ask you something?" "Yeah." "When you filed those reports, the Marsh reports, and nothing happened." Brianna paused. "How did you keep going?" Maya thought about this. It was a real question and it deserved a real answer. "I kept going because the patients were still there," she said. "Every day I came in, the people in those beds needed someone to catch what other people missed. The fact that the institution was failing to respond to what I was reporting didn't change what was in front of me." She paused. "I was angry. I stayed angry for a long time, but I didn't let the anger make me stop looking." Brianna nodded slowly. "Were you scared when they fired you?" "Yes." No hesitation. "I had a mortgage and 11 years of career at stake, and I had no idea what came next." She met Brianna's eyes. "Being scared and being right are not incompatible. People act like you have to choose. You don't." "What if nobody had come?" Brianna said. "What if the federal call never happened?" Maya had thought about this. She had thought about it in the 11 hours of sleep after she came home from a 36-hour stretch, and in the quiet of her apartment in the early mornings before her shifts, and in the particular form of honesty that comes when you've been through enough to stop performing certainty to yourself. Then I would have filed the documentation with the state nursing board, she said, and contacted the hospital's accreditation body directly. And if those went nowhere, I would have found a healthcare attorney. She paused. I was not going to stop. The federal investigation accelerated the timeline. It didn't create the outcome. The outcome was always going to happen because I wasn't going to let go of what I knew. Brianna looked at her for a long moment. I want to be like that, she said. I don't know if I'm built that way. You held a patient off the floor with one arm while managing a radio and an IV line, Maya said. You're built for more than you think. She turned back to the board. Now go check bed 11. His last pressure was borderline, and I want to recheck in 20. Brianna went. The formal ceremony, if it could be called that, which Maya would not have, because she had a consistent discomfort with institutional theater, was scheduled for the first Friday of December, 4 weeks after the night of the stairwell and the pharmacy bag and the woman in room 412, who had looked at her with clear, direct eyes and said thank you in a way that was not decorative. The hospital board had requested Maya's presence. Adayeze Nwofor had told her, in the call to arrange it, that the board intended to make a formal public acknowledgement of the circumstances of her termination and reinstatement, and that they wanted to present her with the hospital's patient safety recognition, an annual honor that had, in previous years, been determined by a committee that had consistently managed not to select the nurses who most deserved it. Maya had said she would come. She had also said, I want Dina Trofimov and Seun Adeyemi acknowledged in the same ceremony, not separately, same room, same moment. Nwofor had not hesitated. Done. The room was the 6th floor conference room again. The same long table, the same view of Carver City, but arranged differently, chairs in rows rather than around the table, and fuller than Maya had expected. The nursing staff was there in number, both the people she knew well and the ones she knew less well, the ones who had watched her walk out with a cardboard box, and the ones who had been working in other units and had only understood what they'd lost after she was gone. Simon Varga was there, standing near the back with his arms folded and the particular expression of a man attending something he had chosen to attend rather than been required to. Marcus Brandt was there, in his security uniform, standing straighter than usual. Brianna was in the 3rd row, next to a nurse Maya recognized from the step-down unit, both of them with the slightly formal composure of people who were unused to being in rooms like this and were handling it with dignity. Dina was in the 2nd row, in a blazer Maya had never seen her wear, with her hands folded in her lap and her back straight. Seun was beside her. Nwofor spoke first, and she spoke clearly and without the softening language of institutional self-protection. She described what had happened at Dellwood General, the pharmaceutical diversion, the suppression of patient safety reporting, the termination of a nurse whose documentation had been accurate and whose removal had been retaliatory. In plain terms that left no interpretive ambiguity. She named the failures. She named the harm. She did not use the passive voice. Then she looked at Maya. On behalf of this board, she said, I want to say clearly, we failed you. The structures that existed in this institution to protect patient safety reporting failed. The administrative leadership of this hospital made choices that were wrong, and the board did not have the oversight in place to catch those choices before they caused harm. She paused. That's an institutional failure, and it is also a human failure, and we are accountable to both. The room was very quiet. Maya Reeves was terminated for doing her job correctly, Nwofor continued. That termination has been formally reversed and her personnel record corrected. Her patient safety documentation has been validated by the federal investigation and will be part of the permanent institutional record of this hospital. She turned slightly. Dina Trofimov and Seun Adeyemi also filed concerns that were dismissed or mishandled. Their reports are now part of the federal record, acknowledged accurately for what they were, nurses doing what nurses are supposed to do. Dina's jaw moved once, and then was still. Seun looked at his hands for a moment, and then looked up. Nwofor turned back to Maya. We'd like you to say a few words, she said, if you're willing. Maya stood. She had thought about what she wanted to say. She had also thought about the fact that she was not a person who performed well in rooms that were watching her, not because she was uncomfortable with attention, but because she had always found that the things worth saying were better said plainly, and plainness was sometimes harder to deliver in front of an audience than the kind of language that sounded like a speech. She looked at the room. She looked at Brianna in the third row, and at Dina, and at Seun, and at Simon Varga in the back with his arms folded. She looked at nurses she had worked beside for 6 years, and nurses she had met in the last 3 weeks, and one security guard who had followed Marcia's badge access through a stairwell at midnight because someone had asked him to, and he had said simply, yes. "I'm not going to tell you that this came out right because I never gave up," she said. "I'm going to tell you that this came out right because a lot of people, in a lot of small moments, chose to do the correct thing even when it was easier not to." She paused. Dina filed a report 2 years ago that went into a drawer. She didn't know what happened to it. She kept coming to work anyway. Seun flagged a discrepancy 4 years ago and was told he was wrong. He wasn't wrong. He kept coming to work anyway. She looked at Brianna. There are people in this room who have been holding things they didn't know what to do with, noticing things they weren't sure they had the standing to report, asking themselves whether they were wrong because the institution told them they were wrong. She paused. "You were not wrong," she said. "You were never wrong. The instinct that told you something was off. That's not a liability. That's the whole job." She looked at the room for a moment longer. "Patients don't need our history," she said. "They don't need our credentials or our titles or our recognition. They need us present, paying attention, willing to say out loud what we see, even when the structure around us is trying to manage us into silence." She paused. "That's it. That's everything. The rest of this, the investigation, the proceedings, what happens to the people who made these choices, that's accountability. That's important. But it's not the work." She looked at the board, at Nuofor. "The work is in the unit. It always has been." She sat down. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Varga, from the back, started to clap. He did it with the deliberate, unhurried quality of a man who didn't do things for performance, but was doing this because he meant it. And then the room followed, not in the way of politeness, but in the way of people releasing something they had been carrying. Dina looked over at Maya from the second row. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Maya looked back at her. Then she looked at the window. The Carver City skyline, the cold December light coming in at a low angle, the ordinary external world of a city that had kept moving through all of it. In a federal courthouse 300 miles away, Raymond Caulfield's attorney was reviewing a plea arrangement that would define the rest of his client's life. In a separate proceeding in the same city, Marcia's indictment was being finalized. In a health law firm in Carver City, Victor Hale was sitting across from Gordon Welch, reading through cooperation documentation, confronting in precise legal language the cost of every choice that had seemed at the time like a small and manageable compromise. None of them had believed, when they built the structure of their arrangements, that a nurse with a cardboard box and 11 years of experience and a history she never talked about would be the thing that brought it down. They had looked at her and seen someone easily managed, someone who could be filed away like the report she had submitted, redirected into a dead end, contained within the administrative machinery that they controlled. They had been wrong about her in the specific way that people were wrong when they looked at someone quiet and assumed the quiet was emptiness. It wasn't emptiness. It had never been. Maya drove home after the ceremony with the windows down slightly, the December cold coming in and keeping her alert in the way cold did, and the city passing in the particular way it passed when you knew it well. Not scenery, but context, the physical shape of a life. She took the long way down Kellner Street. She parked. She went upstairs. She stood in her apartment and looked at the photograph on the wall. 8 people on a tailgate. Flat white light. 7 of those 8 faces she could still name in her sleep, could still locate in memory with the specific clarity of people who had been present with her in conditions that stripped everything irrelevant away. She hadn't spoken to most of them in years. Some of them she would never speak to again. She had been made by those years into someone who could do what she did. Not made perfect. She had made mistakes in that life and in this one, and would make more, because that was the architecture of any life lived honestly. But made capable, made steady, made into someone who knew the difference between fear and danger, between patience and surrender, between the noise of an institution and the signal underneath it. She made coffee. She sat at the kitchen table. She opened her laptop. She had 3 things to do: write her formal witness statement for the federal proceedings, which she had been drafting in sections over the last 2 weeks. Send Janelle a date for the Atlanta visit. And look, for the first time in the 2 weeks since everything had broken open, at what came next. She didn't know exactly what came next. She knew she was going back to the ICU. She knew that the unit she was returning to was not the unit she had left. Not because the walls had changed or the monitors had changed, but because the people in it had been through something that had clarified, in the most direct possible way, what mattered and what didn't. She knew that there were going to be board meetings and investigation hearings and procedural sessions that would make demands on her attention that she would meet, because they were necessary, and the record required witnesses who told the truth. She knew also that those proceedings were not her purpose. They were the consequence of her purpose, the downstream result of 11 months of seeing clearly and refusing to stop seeing. The purpose itself was the same as it had always been. The unit, the patients, the 15 or 16 or 20 names on a board at any given time, each one attached to a person who needed someone paying attention. She opened the witness statement and continued writing. Outside her window, Carver City moved through its evening in the unremarkable way of cities: traffic, light changes, people walking dogs past her building without looking up. The small, ordinary machinery of a place where most things were fine, and some things were not. And the difference between those 2 categories depended, more often than anyone acknowledged, on whether the right person was paying attention at the right moment. She had been that person. She would continue to be that person. Not because it was heroic. It wasn't heroic, it was just work. It was just the daily choice to remain awake to what was in front of her. But because she was, at the core of what she was, someone who could not look away from what needed to be seen. That was the truth of her. Not the deployment history, or the classified file, or the federal investigation, or the ceremony in the 6th-floor conference room with the December light coming through the windows. Those were things that had happened to her, around her, because of her. What she was existed before all of them, and would exist after. She typed the next sentence of the statement. Outside, the evening settled in. The city did what cities do. It kept moving, indifferent and necessary, full of people carrying things they hadn't figured out yet, and things they had figured out at great cost, and things they would never figure out at all. And in the ICU at Dellwood General Hospital, the monitors beeped with their steady, indifferent rhythm, and the night shift was coming on, and someone was looking at the board and at the patient in bed 7 and noticing something that the last check had not caught, and moving, because that was what you did. You moved. You did not wait for permission or recognition or certainty. You moved toward what needed you. And the work continued, as it always had, as it always would.